If you are trying to build your first JavaScript project, but you don't know where to start, this is one of my go-to exercises to get you building without the aid of a tutorial. Now, instead of thinking of a full website or a full application or a game, it's better to actually think smaller. Think in terms of components, and something like an HTML form is brilliant. Forms power the web. The more practice you have with forms, ultimately the better. So what I have here is just a simple HTML form, and we have a few inputs. Type text, type email, password, number, date. We have a submit button to then go and submit the form. And we just have a single div element to show any validation errors. And in the JavaScript, we are fetching that form by using .getElementById, and then we are attaching the submit event listener to listen for that event, and here is the callback logic. So this is the bit that we can improve. At the moment, we are creating variables for each input. So input 1, we go and fetch .getElementById input 1, and then get to the value. Do that for each input, and we have a single conditional to check if any of these inputs are empty. An empty string is falsy. Any of them are empty. Then to get the error message div, that div over here, and then set the text content to a specific error message. And of course, to return, to exit out that function so that we are not continuing with the form logic. The validation has failed at this point. This can be improved. For one thing, we are only doing one type of validation here. We're only checking if it's required. We should also check that all of these inputs meet the type. So for example, we should check that this input is of type email. Now here's the thing. There are obviously HTML attributes like this that provide native browser validation, which do the work for you. But this isn't a portfolio project. You're not trying to impress anyone. You're here to practice JavaScript. So I would encourage you to forget about performance, forget about best practice, and remove these attributes for now. So don't use things like required, we won't do that. And then we will also remove these types, and we can go and do that for each input. Then in our conditional, we can extend this to check for each input, check its type, and run the relevant validation function, which you're going to have to write. You will need a function to check a string is an email. You might want to look up different ways of doing that. The same for something like a date. That could be tricky. What should that format be? How can you work with dates in JavaScript? Password could be fun. What should the requirements for the password be? A certain number of capital letters and numbers? How do you indicate that to the user? Which brings me to the next area of improvement. We have a single error message. Usually in a form, you would want to put the error message beneath the specific input that is failing that validation. One way of doing that is to go and place this div next to each input. But look at how already that clutters the HTML. Wouldn't it be better, since we're working in JavaScript, just to create that element and append it to this div? And if we're trying to clear the error messages, to remove any divs with that specific error class. Finally, one other thing I don't quite like is that for each input, we have created a variable and used .getElementById. One problem with that is that you need to hard code the ID for every single input. The other issue is that what if you had 20 different inputs? That's going to be a lot of different variables, and your conditionals get very long and complicated. We could instead do something like this. Const all inputs equal, and instead of getElementById, let's use query selector. Query selector all would give us all of the inputs, and we want to do it by type of input. Now I just need to loop through these inputs, and for each input to execute the relevant validation. Two challenges there. How should I loop through the inputs? Should I use a simple for loop? Should I use a for each loop? Or is there another way of doing it? For now, let's just use a simple for loop. For I equals 0, I must be less than all inputs.length, and we need to operate on I. Now we have something that accomplishes exactly the same as this, but we've just done it inside of a loop, which is much easier code to maintain. All inputs.I, for example, we can call const current input and replace that, and that reads a lot better. So if current input value is empty, then to go and set that validation error message. But what about the other validations? How do we know if this current input is the email input? Well, there are a few different ways of doing that. You might want to look at perhaps using some sort of attribute that we can extract, like a data attribute, so we can see the type that way if we were to avoid the native type attribute. Or perhaps you might want to keep some sort of configuration. So const validation config, which is a dictionary we can look up for specific elements. So if it was input 1, we could have an array of it needs to be required and it needs to be of type text. Then inside here we can check if current input is input 1, then we can go and run the validation functions for each validation type. There's lots of things that you can do here, and that's the point. Even something as basic as an HTML form, you can always keep adding features, you can keep making improvements, you can keep testing your skills and your fundamentals, and you don't need to think in terms of an entire app or website. I hope you find that useful. Let me know in the comments if you have any luck working with a form as your first JavaScript project.